ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here today. It is so nice for all of us to be, as other people have said, nice to be in the same space, in the same room together.
Yeah.
What a novel idea that you can gather together.
Especially when I have terrible problems with Zoom.
Yeah, and you know, it was a good interim solution, but it's nice to be together. And I also want to say thank you to Elaine and the staff here at the Erlanger branch and in Elaine's department for all of their help coordinating this. And we appreciate, we know there's a lot that goes into putting this together. Okay, so I'm Tracey Howerton. I'm the, come on and sit down. I'm the local history librarian at Boone County Public Library's main location. Those of you who know about us, we have referred to ourselves as the local history and genealogy department. We still claim that name functionally, but as I'm sure Bridget talked about in her previous discussion, we recently rebranded as the Borderlands Archive and History Center. So if you start seeing this acronym or this name, it's still us. That's just a look at our homepage for our department within the library's larger website. And again, we're located at the main location in Burlington. And my discussion today is titled Examining the Doctor, Kentucky and Ohio's Benjamin Franklin, or B.F. Stevenson, 1812 to 1902. And before we begin, I want to just talk about a few disclaimers. I just want everyone to understand this is intended to be an overview or a highlights reel of B.F. Stevenson's life. My goal is to bring to light his life, writings, and travels, especially as they relate to Boone County, Northern Kentucky, and Cincinnati. My research relied heavily upon family history, genealogy research. I touch on some of his descendants and their lives, especially in the beginning, to show connections. Because as I embarked on this research journey, as other people have used earlier, B.F. Stevenson had not yet been linked to other family members in the Kentucky history resources that I was accessing. So I wanted to make sure people understood that it was only because I could find stuff on his relatives that I eventually could end up linking him and connecting him. So B.F. Stevenson's story gives us a sense of life in 19th century Kentucky, but it's not intended to be an in-depth overview of the period nor of the Civil War. I'm not a PhD candidate or historian in 19th century Kentucky history or the Civil War. Those are two huge topics. But my research, my time spent researching him helped me learn more about those topics. And really what my main goal is just what can we learn from his life and path. So Benjamin Franklin Stevenson was born in Mason County, Kentucky on June 11th, 1812. He comes from a first-generation Kentucky family. His paternal grandparents were Thomas and Sarah Stevenson. Thomas and Sarah migrated west from Maryland in the post-Revolutionary War period around the late 1780s. They migrated down the Ohio River, as many migrants did at the time. But interestingly, there's a dramatic story in William Henry Perrin's History of Bourbon, Scott, and Nicholas Counties, published in 1882, which is a huge volume if you haven't had reason to access that. It's got all kinds of information there. But there's family-specific account, migration story is documented in there in dramatic detail. And so Thomas and Sarah eventually settled in the Limestone, Maysville area, and then after a short period moved inland closer to the Washington area. And Thomas and Sarah are interesting because they're credited with bringing Methodism to that part of Kentucky. And some of you have probably seen this map before. This is just a snippet from the larger Carey State map of Kentucky from 1814. But I like to show that, just number one, because of course we're all probably map nerds in this group, but it's interesting to look at how it was represented at the time. And you can see the Limestone, Maysville, and Washington area highlighted. I have a little red arrow pointing to that. And again, just briefly on the second and third generations and some information about his descendants. Job Stevenson, who was a son of Thomas and Sarah, eventually moved to Scott County, and he established numerous successful businesses, including a saddlery. Reuben Stevenson, a brother to Job and another son of Thomas and Sarah's, married Cassandra Jones in 1809, and they later moved to Georgetown, Scott County in the 1810s. And Reuben also was in the saddlery business. I wasn't able to prove that he went to work with his brother, but it seems likely or logical that he may have joined in the brothers' business. Reuben and Cassandra had a number of children. We're just going to talk about a few, like 3 today. Their firstborn son was Thomas B. Stevenson. He was born in 1810. B.F. Stevenson, the focus of the talk today, was again born on June 11th, 1812. 1 year after his birth, the father Reuben volunteered to serve in the War of 1812. And on the left, you're looking at an image of the widow's pension application information for Cassandra when she was applying for a pension through Reuben's service. You can see it shows he was enlisted August 15th, 1813 to November 19th of 1813, and he served with Captain Richard Madson's company in the militia. And so thankfully Reuben survives his war service for the War of 1812, comes home, and a year later their son Milton is born in 1814. So today's discussion really is going to focus on my primary person, B.F. Stevenson, but I am going to touch on his brother Thomas and brother Milton a little bit. Unfortunately, Father Reuben died January 6th of 1823, and that was in Georgetown. And B.F. Stevenson was only 10 or 11 years old at that time, so you can imagine the economic stress that put on the family, and of course he had his younger brother and other siblings. And so I think we can all imagine how difficult that must have been. And just an interesting side note, Uncle Joe, who is his own story, and if you've researched Scott County, he appears in lots of things written about Scott County, but he ended up committing suicide in 1837. And so, again, I just want to emphasize that it was through his brothers Thomas and Milton that I began to piece together the puzzle that ended up helping me figure out who this B.F. Stevenson person was. You'll see this is a newspaper clipping from the Kentucky Sentinel, an advertisement advertising a saddling business, and that's the brothers Benjamin and Milton Stevenson. It says, having commenced the above business on Main Street in Georgetown, solicit a share of public patronage. They will keep on hand of manufacture or on the shortest notice, or a article usual in their line. Those wishing to purchase are respectfully invited to call. And so the earliest indication I could find, I don't think I could find an original clipping from that October, but they gave that, I presume that was their first kind of announcement would have been in that October 1834. So B.F. Stevenson, after running the saddlery business with his brother, and his brother Milton continued to manage that business, but by 1839, B.F. Stevenson enrolled at Transylvania University's medical department in Lexington. He was enrolled there from 1839 to 1841. He was about age 27 when he studied there. I'm sure some of you know Transylvania was a prestigious institution at the time. It was considered the top school in the West or the South. Of course, at that time, this was considered the West. And it was recognized for many things, but they were recognized for having the best library and the best medical instruments for training the candidates or students. Many Civil War surgeons or doctors were trained at Transylvania. Many of you here probably know that. Sometimes I speak to a more general audience and they're not history specialists. So, but interestingly, and you're on the right-hand side, you're looking at the title page for his dissertation. His thesis title was "The Skin and Its Functions," and I thought that was especially interesting since he had all this experience in saddlery and saddle making that kind of seemed to go together in my mind. And you can see on the bottom right, he signed the title page. And you can see that he wrote Georgetown as two separate words. Georgetown, of course, being named for George Washington, and it wasn't until 1846 that they combined the names into one word that we know today. So, and that is that image was from the Transylvania Special Collections. That's available online. So B.F. Stevenson's basically his life timeline starts in Mason County, then he comes to the Georgetown, Scott County, and Lexington area. I have yet been able to pinpoint when he met Anna Liza Towsey, but he ended up marrying Anna Liza Towsey of Boone County. And they were married in May of 1843, and of course on the left-hand side, that's a really nice portrait of Anna Liza that we have in our Towsey Stevenson collection at the library. It's a digital-only collection. I can talk about that a little bit later. B.F. Stevenson and Anna Liza Towsey, from 1844 to 1860, had 5 children. They had 4 daughters and 1 son. And B.F. Stevenson served as a physician in Boone County for roughly 25 years. So he was pretty established in the area for a time. And of course, that's a marriage book record on the right showing their marriage information. Now, I don't know who knows what in this area, but if you're not familiar with Boone County history, the Towsey House is a prominent building in Boone County.
It's a restaurant.
And it is.
It's a restaurant.
It is,
I've
right.
eaten there.
And so their daughter, Anna Liza, married our topic today, B.F. Stevenson. Erastus is the patriarch of the family, and Catherine McHenry was her mother. And this building, I don't have an exact date on that photograph, but it's probably turn of the last century, somewhere in the the early 1900s, probably. We don't have an exact date for it. But today, thankfully, the Towsey House was preserved over time. It could have very easily been knocked over and knocked down. That's a whole separate story. Bridget could probably tell you if you're interested. But thankfully, it was preserved. And today, it's known as the Towsey House Tavern. If you haven't been to Burlington for a meal, it's a lovely place. They've expanded and have a really nice outdoor patio on the side, and they have great food there. So, little pitch for the Towsey House. But they did just celebrate their 200th anniversary in the fall. So again, we're lucky that building is still there today.
You betcha. Yeah.
Now, the Stevensons and the Towseys resided, close together. This is an image taken from the 1850 slave schedule for Boone County. And again, it shows that B.F. Stevenson and Anna Liza Towsey owned slaves, which was, of course, not uncommon for this time period. Erastus Towsey was a fairly wealthy merchant, and he owned slaves as well. This is a whole separate side conversation. I'm not going to go into it, but I did find a lot about this topic in my research. And it's too complicated to go into because we're just getting started today, but it definitely warrants discussion further down the road. Now, this is a view of the 1860 U.S. Census for Burlington and Boone County. In the 1850 census, you just saw the slave schedule, but in the regular census, B.F. Stevenson and Anne and Erastus and Catherine were living in separate households. But by 1860, it shows them all residing in the same household. On the top left, you see it shows Erastus Towsey, age 61, as a retired merchant. And it shows you the value of his real estate. And then a few lines down, you see B.F. Stevenson, age 48, and listed as a physician, and his wife as Anne Eliza there, and their children. So I don't know, I wasn't able to answer this question for sure, but I have a theory that Erastus began experiencing health challenges at some point in this period, and so they may have combined households for that reason, but we're also getting really close to the Civil War, so there may have been some sort of reason that caused them to all live together. And I still haven't been able to figure out where he and Anne lived prior, and maybe I will never figure that out, but it is an unanswered question. So by December of 1861, B.F. Stevenson was impelled to enlist in the Union effort. And he traveled to, and there's a lot that goes on in between them, but I'm again, I'm trying to keep it general today. Stevenson traveled to Louisville in December of 1861 to meet with the U.S. Army Medical Board. Remember, he's a trained physician from Transylvania. He enlisted on December 12th and was mustered in by December 16th of 1861. He served briefly as an assistant surgeon for the 23rd Regiment of the Kentucky Infantry at Camp King in Covington, but very quickly was nominated to serve as a surgeon for the 22nd Regiment of the Kentucky Infantry in January of 1862. So, of course, they needed people to fill those roles, right?
I think Camp King is now the ball field for Holmes High School.
Perfect. And I didn't research that detail, but I was
But
trusting somebody
yeah.
would know the answer,
Yeah.
right? And that's right. So anyway, so very quick turnaround, and then he was ordered to report to Colonel D.W. Lindsay in Ashland, Kentucky, and oversaw the hospital camp there. This is a clip from the title page of the handbook for the military surgeon. This was basically a military field guide for the surgeons serving in the Civil War. I found this online through the Cincinnati Public Library's digital library, and I'll just read this briefly. It says, being a compendium of the duties of the medical officer in the field, the sanitary management of the camp, the preparation of food, etc., with forms for the requisitions for supplies, returns, the diagnosis and treatment of camp dysentery, of course, and all the important points in war surgery, including gunshot wounds, amputation, wounds of the chest, abdomen, arteries, and head, and the use of chloroform. So again, this was the handbook that you would take out into the field as you're going to work as a military surgeon. But also interesting is it was published out of Cincinnati by the Robert Clark Company. This was published in 1862. And so some of you probably know the publishing industry in Cincinnati. So this would have been one of the, they basically probably had a government contract, right?
Yeah, probably.
So anyway, found that and thought that was an interesting piece of the puzzle. Now, before B.F. Stevenson leaves northern Kentucky, he took care of some personal business. He secured a prescription to be delivered from Cincinnati to Burlington for his father-in-law Erastus, who was ill. He also arranged to write occasional letters from the field for the Cincinnati Gazette newspaper. I can explain why that was later, but that's just know that point. He did this under the pen name Medico, which some of you probably know, protected his identity, protected his family. He's serving for the Union in a not terribly Union-friendly area. So there's probably many reasons why he chose the pen name. That's not uncommon for that time. But he also received issues of the paper in the mail as payment. So today we take for granted our access to information, but it's hard to imagine how little access to information they would have had as they're out serving, doing what they're doing in the Army, in the war effort. And luckily for us, from the beginning of his service, B.F. Stevenson writes letters to home with great frequency. He was a really prolific letter writer. And he starts writing letters immediately, basically right away. He wrote primarily to his wife, daughters, sister, and sister-in-law, but not exclusively. His nickname for his wife, Anne, was Lida. And on the left-hand side, you're looking at just a couple of clips. It's a much longer original letter. Clips to Juliet is Juliet Towsey, his sister-in-law. So he's writing to Juliet, and you can see at the bottom it says, P.S. I will write to Kate in a day or two. Kate is his eldest daughter. And so these are just a couple of clips. I just wanted people to be able to see an example of his handwriting. And this one was from October 30th of 1862. So this is well into his first year of service. And the other interesting thing that I noticed in reading through his letters is he was writing, most of his, not all, but many of his letters were written to female members of the family, but he did not spare the women from the difficulties of the war. He wasn't going to go into, gruesome detail, but he was not, he wasn't protecting them from unpleasant things that he was seeing. So I think for the time period, to me, that seemed interesting that he wanted to make sure they understood what he was experiencing. He often, in his letters, he complained of mail being sent out of Burlington being slowed down. There may have been many reasons for that, but he complained a lot and told them, after a certain point, he said, please send the mail out of Cincinnati because something's happening to my mail out of Burlington. So we can speculate why that might have been. But he's a wonderful letter writer. He writes vivid descriptions of the landscapes, the sights, the camp life, the people and the animals, all of the things he's seeing as he goes about his war service. Stevenson's military service can basically be summarized this way. The first half of his service in 1862 was spent in the Eastern Theater, in the Eastern Ohio River Valley, Eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, and it was related to early Union Army assaults on the Cumberland Gap. The second half of his service, from 1863 to 1864, was primarily spent in the Western Theater, with campaigns along the Mississippi River, near Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and related to engagements near Vicksburg and Jackson. Now that's a very great generalization, but you can think of it that way. He visited family in Georgetown on one occasion. I believe he rode by horseback. They were stopped, and so he rode to Georgetown. And I believe at least one time to Burlington, and then his wife and one of his daughters met him at a port on the Ohio River. But basically, based on my research, those were the only times he had interaction with his family during his service. So you can imagine how difficult that might have been. And like so many families involved in this in the Civil War, while he was away from away in the service, they experienced many personal losses. His father-in-law, Erastus Towsey, died in January of 1863. His eldest brother, Thomas B. Stevenson, died in November of 1863. And then as you go along and read the letters, Anne starts to write about her own worrisome health issues. So you can imagine the pressure of the patriarch of the family passes away, his eldest brother, who at that time was in Maysville, passed away, and Anne is, at home, and there's a lot to be stressed out about, of course. So I will say briefly that he was being pressured almost throughout for him to come home. She wanted him to come home. Other people serving were starting to ask for discharge and that. But he was very committed to his service and felt like he needed to stay put, basically. So, but eventually her health issues get serious enough that he finally, and he also was denied, he did request to be discharged several times, but was denied, right? So it was a very difficult, obviously would have been a difficult situation. He, in early 1864, he does finally submit a request to be honorably discharged. There are some delays, and finally in March of 1864, he's in New Orleans, and he finally receives permission. And on the right-hand side, you're looking at his formal military discharge papers. We're lucky to have a digital copy of that in our Towsey-Stevenson collection. He does not travel up the Mississippi River. He actually opts to pay to take boats around through the Gulf Coast, through the Gulf of Mexico and around the Atlantic coast. I think there are probably a few reasons why he didn't want to take the Mississippi River option. But he does finally return home in early April of 1864. And even though he's finally home in Burlington in northern Kentucky, his service does not stop. He continues to be engaged. And so in December of 1864, he wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln. You can see he titles it His Excellency A. Lincoln, President of the United States. And he's writing to Lincoln to warn him of a possible visit to Washington City by Robert Terrell of Boone County. Terrell will be going to meet with the president to seek release of Nathan Walton, the son of John Walton of Boone County, who is being held in a prison camp at Camp Morton, Indiana. And he says to Terrell, he says that Terrell, quote, may make loud professions of loyalty to the Union, but a more disloyal man does not live in the state. And at the end he said he apologizes for interfering, but writes, justice to our suffering, starving Union prisoners prompts me to do so. So I was really excited to find this in the Library of Congress. They've digitized all of Abraham Lincoln papers, and I found this letter that B.F. Stevenson wrote, and it says at the top, Boone County, Kentucky.
How did you come upon that?
I started fishing.
Fishing?
Just going fishing. And I went on the Library of Congress website. I basically had, the advantages I had were Burlington is a fairly unique name for a place, and B.F. Stevenson is a fairly unique name.
Mm-hmm.
So I got lucky, the magic of digital searching, and that popped up. I was super excited. So anyway, so, and in the post-war, his kind of immediate post-war period, unfortunately, his wife, Annalisa Towsey Stevenson, finally does succumb to whatever illness she's suffering from and died on July 16th of 1865. So that's just 1 year after he comes home. So you can imagine the emotion and the difficulty of that. He does show up in Boone County tax lists and court records until about 1869. He shows up trying to get paid for some of his medical services he's providing to people and things like that. But eventually, I did start kind of looking around to see where he might have gone, and he shows up in the Cincinnati business directories, having opened started his own medical practice, and his office was listed at the southeast corner of 7th and Vine. So we know he eventually kind of starts connecting up to Cincinnati. And of course, the drama of daily life, even though the war was over, there were plenty of dramatic things still going on. And unfortunately, in September of 1869, Dr. B.S. Stevenson was called to a scene in downtown Cincinnati. A man by the name of Warren Kennedy, who was a bookseller and periodical dealer with an office on Vine Street, jumped from a 4th-story window. Dave Schroeder was just talking about a suicide story,
Yeah,
and I have one too. Actually, I have a few. So there's more in the research of him. Suicide is a theme throughout his life. So it was interesting to find this story. But this gentleman, unfortunately, obviously appears to have had a drinking problem. Something led him to jump from a 4th-story window. And I'll just read the blurb. It's a great article. I'm happy to share it later. But it says, in his fearful descent, he struck Captain L. Barney, editor of the Commercial Bulletin, who appeared for a time to be very badly hurt. He was carried into the store of Perry and Morton, where Dr. B.F. Stevenson was called to his assistance. 1 or 2 of his ribs appeared to have been started, but no bones were broken, and it was thought by the surgeon that he had not suffered serious internal injuries, which is amazing because a man fell on him out of, from a 4th-story window. As soon as he had sufficiently recovered from the shock, a carriage was procured and he was conveyed to his home. So Dr. Stevenson's office actually would have been fairly close to that. He also had connections to the Cincinnati Gazette, so for whatever reason, he was the doctor that was called to the scene. Again, his commitment to his military service didn't end when he came home. B.F. Stevenson was very active in Union veterans fraternal and advocacy organizations, including the Grand Army of the Republic, or some of you may know as the G.A.R., and the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, which is abbreviated as MOLLIS. The G.A.R., some of you may know, are known for helping make Memorial Day a holiday in 1868. They had local chapters that held monthly meetings, and then they had big national encampment meetings. I'm sure some of you know some of this. They would meet for fellowship and advocacy, but they also, one of the main issues that they concerned themselves with were pensions for surviving soldiers or family members of widows and orphan children. So at their meetings, because this was long before TV and radio, part of the entertainment at these meetings were people gave lectures, and Dr. Stevenson gave at least 2 noteworthy speeches. And in this case, you're looking at the top clip is announcing that the meeting is happening that evening. He's going to speak on the topic, the Cumberland Gap Campaign of 1862. And then at the bottom is letting you know that the event happened and that Dr. Stevenson read an interesting, was filled with an interesting audience of ladies and gentlemen to listen to a paper prepared by Dr. B.F. Stevenson, a comrade of the Post. So again, I was excited to find that. I want to give a shout out to my colleague Hillary Delaney, who's here. When I first started doing this research, she ended up finding B.F. Stevenson's name on the 1883 Atlas. Some of you might be familiar with the 1883 Atlas for Boone, Kent. We use it almost every day. It's a wonderful resource. We're happy to show you if you're not familiar. But his name appeared on the map, so I started trying to figure out why that was. When they built a postal station, the railroad being built and a postal station being established in the Canton, Visalia area, opened that part of Kenton County up for growth and development. And it ended up becoming an area where the urban, well-to-do built their country homes. Some of you probably know this, and it was a recreation area, right? So B.F. Stevenson's family were among the families that established residences out that way. And the top right, you can see his house sat right between the railroad and the river, the Licking River. And then if you look across the railroad tracks, you'll see the Fennell residence. And General John William Fennell was also a Transylvania grad, so they were kind of, had that in common. He was a former Union general. He was very involved in a lot of things, was a newspaper printer and editor, was an attorney, and he served in the Kentucky legislature. And I believe I read he was one of the lawyers representing, he was involved in the Margaret Garner case when that happened. I believe, don't quote me on that. But his home was named Sunnyside. So you can imagine these folks coming out to the country to get away from the pollution of the city and enjoying the countryside out there. I still haven't been able to pinpoint kind of exactly when he made that transition, but I'm sure I could find it if I try hard enough. The main thing I want people to remember and take away from my talk today is in 1884, Dr. B.F. Stevenson published an impressive compilation of his wartime letters and post-war reflections in a book titled Letters from the Army by B.F. Stevenson, Surgeon to the 22nd Kentucky Infantry. The book is appropriately dedicated to the memory of his buried wife. So remember, he wrote all of those letters. He was writing letters so much. Well, thankfully, by the 1870s, 1880s, he must have decided this is worthy of being put into a book.
It's fantastic.
So a first edition was published by the W.E. Dibble Company of Cincinnati, and it was so popular that a second edition was published by the Robert Clark Company. Those were the publishers of that military guide I showed you earlier. So it was fairly popular, this is available online, but if you do just a simple Google search, you won't come up with it because it's such a generic title. If you're really interested, the whole book is digitized and available through either Google Books or the Hadley Trust library. And if you're interested, just contact me after and I'll kind of walk you through that. But you can read the whole thing from start to finish, which is what I did a number of years ago at this time. Thanks to COVID, this all got kind of interrupted. But another thing that was interesting that I found about him, and goes back to my early discussion about his brothers, is B.F. Stevenson was clearly concerned about the retelling of the war and the experiences that he and his colleagues went through during the war. So his letters from the Army would have been one example of him and the lectures that he gave. But he also, in March of 1886, donated his eldest brother, Thomas B. Stevenson's letters and personal papers to the Historical and Philosophical Society of Ohio, which we now, that collection is now
Cincinnati Historical.
maintained by the Cincinnati History Library and Archives at the Museum Center. So I was super excited. COVID was sort of over and they had opened back up. So I finally was able to go look at that collection because I couldn't get to it. But I was super excited to find this one image. This is the only image I could find of his brother, Thomas B. Thomas is the oldest of the children. He's a super fascinating person too. And he was a newspaper editor. He was a newspaper man in Maysville, Cincinnati, and Frankfurt at least. I think those were his main places. He was also an associate of Henry Clay. So there are letters in that collection he's writing, and he's involved in 19th century the political scene. That's above my knowledge level, so I can't interpret that well. But it was because of someone else's writing about Thomas B. Stevenson that I was able to look at the footnotes, and then I started connecting my guy to him, right? So really important connection. I would say my second most important thing, other than him publishing letters from the Army, is he continued to be actively involved in the G.A.R. and in the National Encampment meeting for August of 1890 was held in Boston, Massachusetts. And this was at the height of the Grand Army of the Republic's membership and popularity. So, they have local and state chapters, and then they have these big national meetings. And you can see this is a clipping from the Boston Sunday Globe announcing that Boston is ready for the veterans. And of course, this was also sort of this was a big economic engine for the host city to have all of these Civil War veterans coming, in this case Union veterans, coming to the city for their big meeting. And it was it lasted a week long, so it was a big deal, right? But thankfully and interestingly, it was at this meeting that B.F. Stevenson was elected the Surgeon General of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was obviously a huge, huge honor for him. You can see it made the newspapers, the National Tribune in Washington, D.C. announced that he was named the new Surgeon General for the G.A.R. Again, this was the time when they're, raising awareness about the need for pensions and care for the now older veterans that are still, or their surviving family members. So it was a huge deal, and this was a nice clipping because it gives you a nice bio summary of Dr. Stevenson. And the other interesting note is that the G.A.R., one of the men credited with originally founding the G.A.R. was also named Dr. B.F. Stevenson. He was the first Surgeon General in 1865 to 1866, but he was from Springfield, Illinois. So as I was starting to get my research, I was finding this other B.F. Stevenson, and I was like, okay, who are these two guys? And so
what's the chances of that?
the symbolism, you can appreciate the symbolism that he would eventually have acquired that honor as well. So, but in the research, the challenge in the research was making sure you're looking at the right B.F. Stevenson.
Right. Yeah. Jeez.
And that is one of the images I have of him, which I don't have a lot. Oh, why are we jumping back so much? Okay, so a high point for B.F. Stevenson would have been to be announced as the Surgeon General for the Grand Army of the Republic. A low point in his life was when he was struck by a train in October of 1893. Coming back and forth from Cincinnati to Visalia, somehow there was a situation where he was crossing the tracks to get to a train, and unfortunately he was struck by a passenger train. This was a big news story. Those of you who have done newspaper research know all the different accounts, they don't always line up exactly, but it was well documented. This clipping I took from the Boone County Recorder, and I'll go ahead and read that. It says, Dr. B.F. Stevenson, you can see they spelled his name wrong, many years ago a citizen of Burlington, but now a resident of Visalia, Kenton County, was seriously and probably fatally hurt in Covington Monday. The accident happened at the C&O depot in that city and was the result of his trying to cross the railroad in front of an approaching train. The doctor stepped from the depot and, unmindful of the approaching train, started for the Visalia train, which was lying on the side track, when the engine struck him with full force, knocking him clear of the track, else he would have been ground to pieces. He was unconscious when picked up, and an examination that followed revealed a number of ugly bruises about the head and body. So again, this nice view from Bernie Spence's Northern Kentucky Views website gives you an idea of how unpleasant an experience that would have been. But of course it was a dramatic news story, and everybody was assuming he was not going to make it. However, I was super excited to find 1 week later, Dr. Stevenson himself writes a letter to the editor of the newspaper. I still want to go back and find out if this appeared in more than one paper, but I found this in the Cincinnati Tribune, and he basically is saying, kind of like the Mark Twain story, you know, news of my death has been largely whatever.
Yeah.
He's letting people know that he is alive. This letter gives you a sense of his personality and earnestness. And toward the end, he says, bruises and abrasions were found all over my body, and I have since suffered much pain, but no bones were broken in my terrible encounter with the Iron Monster. And on the day of the accident, I was 81 years, 5 months, and 4 days old. Now, the reason he specifies his age is because none of the news reports reported his age correctly. They all reported him as being like age 70 or something.
What's
So
the address, Russell?
the address, see, I also don't think that's his. I think that was, I think it's a son-in-law's address. It's not his home address. I can talk about that later. But that was part of the mystery, because I was like, what? Because I did look that up in the city directories, and he wasn't listed at that address. So I think he might have been recovering at that address.
He wasn't sure about the railroad company, because he had the L&N Railroad question mark.
Right, and then, yes, and then the reporting accounts, there's a lot of little details to work out with who's reporting it, right? So, anyway, so in my research, I did find 3 images of Dr. B.F. Stevenson. The earlier newspaper account from the National Tribune, which had like the etching or the woodcut or whatever it would have been. This image showed up in a digital version of a Military Order of the Loyal Legion album that Cincinnati Public Library has digitized and online. So he's toward the back of it, you know, all the generals and all the muckety-mucks are first, and then he shows up in the back. But I was especially excited to find that image and match it, because this was the original image I had of him in our collection, which I'll talk about in a minute. But so I was able to figure out that he sat for this portrait photograph to be in that album, right? Yeah. So that was cool, because I could make that connection. And so, again, he stayed engaged with the Grand Army of the Republic meetings, and I'm sure some of you know about the big encampment meeting that was held in Louisville in mid-September of 1895. This was super symbolic because it was the first G.A.R. meeting held in the South. It was the first time the blue and the gray sides met in the same place. And so in this newspaper story, they're saying, you know, closing the chasm, there's going to be a big meeting. So this was 30 years after, so it took 30 years after the Civil War for them to be able to be in the same room together, basically, right? So imagine the symbolism there. And at this point, he would have been pretty feeble and old, so he did attend with one of his daughters accompanied him to that meeting. So jump ahead a few years, and so and this was 1895, so we're backing up just a little. I was able to find some obituaries for some of the Towsey women. This is Julia Towsey, who he would have been writing to early in the war. It shows that, unfortunately, she died August of 1888 from cancer of the breast, but she was listed as living in Visalia, Kenton County. And on the right-hand side, this is a clip of a much longer obituary, but you can see it says she died in Visalia, Kenton County at the residence of Dr. B.F. Stevenson, her brother-in-law. And so that gives you a nice account of her. So I was happy to find that. This is really wanting to jump faster than I wanted to jump. And then his mother-in-law, Catherine Towsey, passed away in March of 1895. But you can see for her obituary as well, it shows that she died at Visalia, Kenton County, and was the wife of former Burlington resident Erastus Towsey. So they were a prominent, couple. That was a prominent family in Burlington at the time. She lived to almost be 90 years old. She almost lived, her husband dies in 1863, so she outlived him, and she almost outlived her son-in-law as well. So, but I suspect that they were, if they had several members of the family who were ill, I interpret it as them convalescing in the countryside in Kent County, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a guess.
That's possible.
Right? So finally, by July of 1902, B.F. Stevenson does pass away. And on the left, you see a very brief clipping that says he died at 4204 Floral Avenue at the family residence. And it goes on to say that the interment will be at Burlington, Kentucky. So I think his oldest daughter's husband died before she did, and I think obviously he's getting older, so obviously at some point they decided to move into the city. It makes sense that they would do that if, if he's the head of the household out in Kent County, So I don't know exactly why, but I suspect it made sense for them to come into the city. On the right-hand side, this is a clipping from a lengthy, nice lengthy obituary that appeared in the Maysville Evening Bulletin. And it reads, death claims Dr. B.F. Stevenson, past Surgeon General of the National G.A.R. And it says, his famous book, Letters from the Army, has been read with much interest by members of the G.A.R. in all parts of the country, and was a graphic description of many scenes and incidents of a thrilling nature of the late Civil War. And toward the end of that obituary, it read, he had a wide acquaintance throughout Ohio and Kentucky, and his death will be greatly deplored. So he was prominent enough that he made the news when he passed away, even though it was years after his war service. And that this brings us to one of the challenges or questions is, we don't have any marker showing that he was buried in the old Burlington Cemetery in Burlington. These are clips, these are views of the old Burlington Cemetery. For those of you who aren't familiar with Burlington and Boone County, the old Burlington Cemetery is really just a few blocks down from the Towsey house that we saw earlier, right? So it's you can walk safely. And the Burlington Cemetery has been lovingly preserved over time by some folks who are in other rooms right now. And so there's a Towsey family, a large Towsey family plot in the cemetery. On the right-hand side, you're looking at the front and the rear view of their daughter, Mary Stevenson's gravestone. So she died when she was about 2 to 3 years old. So she was the first child they lost in the 1840s. But on the far right, that's the back side of her stone, and you can see it says daughter of B.F. and A.E. Stevenson. So his name's on her stone. And then the middle left, the rounded stone, is Anne Eliza Towsey Stevenson's headstone. It's in the ground now, and you can see there in the middle it says wife of B.F. Stevenson.
Oh, yeah.
So his name is there, but we don't know that a marker was ever placed there. Matt Becker, who used to just recently retired, I'll get to that in a minute. They have maps of the cemetery of the plots, and he's not in there, right?
Yeah.
So that's still a mystery to be solved. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about kind of how I did the research and how I kind of came to uncover this story. The gentleman on the left is a gentleman named Jack Rouse, who was, I'm sure a few of you know, he's family established in the Walton area of Boone County. He is deceased now, but he was a Civil War buff. He published a couple of Civil War related books on Boone County, and he was important in helping get a Snow's Pond historical marker being placed between, I guess, north of Walton, south of Union, right? But it was because his papers got donated to our library after his death by his friend Tom Schiffer, that he actually ended up having a copy of Letters from the Army in his materials.
I'll be darned.
So when I first started working here, I saw that book. I was like, well, this is interesting. What is this? And I kept it, and I kind of had it in the back of my mind. And then some other things led me to start asking questions. Okay, stop. Okay. In the 1990s, before everybody started doing genealogy research online, with the advent of the digital age, this lady, Eleanor Stevenson Butts, visited Boone County in the 1990s on a genealogy trip. And she is the great-granddaughter of B.F. Stevenson. She and I believe her husband came to see Boone County, to see the Towsey house, and look around, right? Probably go to the cemetery. And she spoke to a person working for Boone County at that time and said, well, I have some photographs and some letters, would you like copies of them or whatever? I'm not quite sure how it went down. But they were able to, they actually have the physical copies. But it was because she was interested in, she's a librarian by trade, and also interested in genealogy. She ended up moving to upstate New York, right, but had a connection to Indiana and wanted to come back and see Boone County for herself. And then because she shared those materials, Matt Becker, in a meeting with Bridget, just by chance, she was talking about something related to the Civil War, and Matt said, well, we have these Civil War letters. It was in their Towsey House file. And so he said, do you guys want to digitize them? And Bridget said, well, of course we do. So we digitized those, and we have a small collection called the Towsey Stevenson Family Collection, basically, that's digitized. Oh, it's reading my, anyway, so, let me see if I can get that to go large again.
Yeah, oh, that's right, he's in there.
Current slide.
I forgot.
Okay, so let me back up one more time. So we have that collection. I can explain more of that to you later. I don't want to take up more time. But I have written a full-length article about my research on Dr. Stevenson.
Northern Kentucky Heritage.
And it's in the Northern Kentucky Heritage magazine, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with.
Yeah.
He's a fascinating guy. There's so much, there's a lot more, and there's actually some stuff I'm still, if I have time, I might try to research. We'll see.
Yeah.
So I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Is
Yeah.
he related to the governor?
The governor, I knew that was going to be a tough
Yeah,
question. In my research, I could not establish a connection.
Connect it.
It's two different Stevensons.
I'll be darned.
The governor, John Stevenson, his descendants came from another state. I can't say absolutely that I completely ruled it out, but in the research that I did, I didn't see a connection. So, but I figured people in this area would want to know.
Yeah.
So the mystery of where he's buried.
Well, and that's what I started doing this research in 2018, 2019, and it started by working on that digital collection. Where's my, started by working on the digital collection, and I did a collection guide for it, and I have an example of that here, right? So this is what the collection guide looks like. And so I started it, and this is about the Towseys and the Stevensons. And I started getting more interested in him because I was like, well, he seems like an interesting guy. And so then I started digging in. I read through pretty much all of Letters from the Army on my own time, not on work time, just to kind of understand it. And then it got me more interested. And so I did, because that clipping says that he died in Cincinnati, I did look online to see if there was like a death index record of some kind, some sort of official, because it was Cincinnati in 1902, probably recorded somewhere. I couldn't find it online. I wanted to go dig in. I did go to Cincinnati Public once before the pandemic. Didn't answer the question. I still would like to dig in and see if I can find another record. So all we know is that newspaper account says he was going to be buried across the river back in Boone County. So if I can solve that mystery someday, I'll try. But I also, part of my goal is to kind of get him on people's radar, so that people can start kind of, if they find something about him, then maybe we'll get some other questions
When
answered.
his children,
Say that
he
again.
had children, they would be buried with his wife?
He was buried with his wife. His oldest son moved to Indiana, William, and was like an accountant in Indiana. So his oldest son he only had one son. William settled in Indiana. The oldest daughter, I believe, is buried with her husband, also in Indiana. And then one of the unmarried sisters is buried with them, right? And so as I was doing this research, I had to pick which rabbit holes to go down. And so, you know, I was like, well, if I don't kind of cut this off somewhere, I'm never going to get done with this. So my goal was to try to get enough together to tell a cohesive story.
Where is he?
What'd you say?
Where is he?
Yeah, so I think he's buried there and it's just not marked.
Just not marked, no.
That either something happened to the stone or maybe they never made a stone. I don't know. It's a mystery.
I think he would have a stone.
I mean, he's pretty prominent.
I mean, he was so prominent.
What about the theory of he was a Union guy? What if there were bad feelings because he served in the Union? I don't know. It's a mystery.
Northern Kentucky was pretty unionized.
Well,
Roughly two.
Burlington, it sounds like there was a lot of post-war violence in Boone County,
Oh,
which is part of my article if you
Well,
read it.
For every 2 regiments of Union soldiers, 1 regiment of Confederate, so it's about 2/3, 1/3.
Yeah. So,
Roughly.
Again, my goal is to try to kind of get his name out there because he kind of, for whatever reason, he sort of maybe fell off the radar a little bit, and see if we can answer some more of these questions.
So is it the famous Stevenson Road in Erlanger?
I don't think, I
No.
assume that's for the governor. But again,
That's
that's
for the
what,
governor?
and my disclaimer about the 19th century stuff is exactly for that reason. I'm not from this area, so I'm not as immersed in the history.
Sure.
I'm still learning myself. So I sort of took the approach of, well, here it is. And if anyone's curious, maybe they can help us answer some more of these questions. So I did want to quickly say, I do have a couple of letters, example letters. Why don't you take one of each? The one letter from 1862 is written to his sister-in-law. He also calls her Judy. And then this is a letter he wrote home to his son from Boston after he received his award for being named the Surgeon General of the G.A.R. So again, does anybody have any other questions? If you end up having more questions, I'm at Boone County Library. Don't hesitate to reach out. And I would encourage you to look up the Northern Kentucky Heritage Magazine and read my
Read the
article.
story.
All right? Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. It's so nice to be